Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Mark My Brain. In today's episode, I would like to urge you to treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And this whole topic revolves around why we often treat ourselves worse than we would anybody else. Why we tell ourselves things we would never tell someone else. And if somebody spoke like that to our friend, we would immediately run to defend them. But it's fine when it comes to self talk, right? This topic revolves around why we rarely support ourselves as much as we would support anyone we care about. Why we might see ourselves as not worthy, whether it comes to support, tone of voice, forgiveness, or anything else. And I bet that does sound familiar to some of you, right? The keener of you might spot that the name of this episode, the treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping, directly reflects one of the rules from Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. And it's true, it's been a big inspiration in preparing this episode. Even though I've read that book many years ago already, some of the lessons, this one included, sort of stuck in my mind, and I drew a lot from it when preparing this episode. And recently this topic re-emerged based on other events in my life, and I was sort of thinking about it. Why is it that we show less care for ourselves than we would for anyone else, for our friends, or even sometimes strangers, right? And example I can give of this sort of behavior can be giving away great advice, but being unable to take your own advice, or going to bed on time. You would advise it to someone else, you would prod your friends to do it, but you yourself can't really stick to the schedule, right? The same with waking up early, working out regularly, committing to your hobbies, etc., etc. So this is the topic I want to tackle in today's episode. I've split it into three parts. Firstly, why is it even important to treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping? Secondly, why we often don't. We'll go over the reasons, what my research suggests. And thirdly, of course, what can we do to sort of course correct? All right, let's jump into it. So as I mentioned, let's start with the question, why is it important to treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping? This is, of course, tied to, plainly speaking, happiness in life, achieving your goals, ambitions, sensing some sort of harmony in life. Responsibility towards ourselves is also an important part. I see it as a sort of a prerequisite for long-term flourishing. And here I will immediately jump to one of the lessons from Jordan Peterson. He says it's basically sort of a moral obligation even to treat yourself with some responsibility and care. Because taking responsibility for one's own well-being is sort of a foundational step towards taking responsibility for the rest of the world. An individual who neglects themselves eventually becomes resentful, vengeful, and physically or emotionally depleted, which diminishes their capacity to serve others, right? To help others. And this is sort of supported by, for example, research on helping professionals, for example, nurses and therapists, which confirms that self-care is an ethically imperative practice and a core professional competency. Without it, the risk, compassion, fatigue, and the reduced ability to help patients is, sort of risked, I guess, or is there. So, yeah, that's I would say one of the reasons why you should treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. Not even for your own sake, maybe, achieving your goals, ambitions, that doesn't convince you really, but it of course translates to everything else you do because you yourself interact with the other world, and without treating yourself with some level of care and responsibility, you don't have the capacity to sort of approach the rest of the world and the rest of life responsibly. And an important note I would like to add here is that this self stewardship, sort of, isn't the same as self indulgence. That's a very big difference. An example can be given that this treating yourself with some responsibility is having the discipline to stick to your diet, or to stop scrolling TikTok or Instagram reels before going to bed, etc. Because it's impacting your well-being negatively in the long term. On the contrast, self-indulgence would be giving in to those sort of impulses. I hope that clears it up. And this sort of whole note about responsibility and moral obligation, if we take it to extreme, we can say that it is intentional, consistent habit of maintaining the mind, body, and spirit to fulfill a higher purpose, whatever that might be. Because by viewing yourself as a temple or a steward of a valuable life, self-care is sort of reframed from this selfishness into a duty to preserve the quote-unquote instrument through which you can contribute to your family and society and to the higher purpose of your choosing. And this sort of resonates with some level of stoicism even, I would say. So okay, those I would say were the main reasons why you should even consider treating yourself with some level of care and responsibility. Now the question of course is why we often don't do it. And this can be shown in many areas of life, as I mentioned. It's not being able to take your own advice, it's going to bed late, it's waking up or being unable to wake up early. It's being unable to commit to working out regularly, committing to your hobbies, whatever it might be. We often sort of forget this responsibility when it comes to ourselves. And several drivers I will talk about, which I have identified during my research on this topic, are archetypal self-loathing, medication adherence, temporal self, self-sabotage and ego protection, and lastly, cultural glorification. So let's touch on each of those, and they will all help us sort of explain why we fall into the bad habit of not treating ourselves with enough care and responsibility. Let's start with the archetypal self-loathing. What do I mean by that? Psychological barriers to self-care often stem from our unique awareness of our own sins, bad habits, and failures. For example, while we view pets or children as innocent, we judge ourselves harshly exactly because we know our own capacity for malice or laziness. This, quote, discovery of nakedness, again, as Jordan talks about it, tying it into the biblical story of Adam and Eve, this leads us to a subconscious conclusion that we are simply not worthy of the best care possible. Repeating again, when an individual views themselves through the lens of their own perceived flaws, they may subconsciously conclude that they are not worthy of the best possible care. And this leads to the state of self-loathing, where the individual mentioned acts as if they are, a fallen angel or even some kind of soulless monster for whom health and harmony are no longer justified. Again, sort of tying it into the biblical terminology there, right? And consequently, the act of self-neglect becomes a form of self-punishment for failing to meet an internal ideal of perfection, for example. And this all can be, of course, happening deep in the subconscious, leaving our conscious thoughts ever wondering why we don't demand the best for ourselves, right? It's logical why can't we do it? You know, the reason might be exactly this, that because you are too self-aware of your own sins and malice and laziness and failures, you sort of are unable to forgive yourself, and subconsciously this leads you to a sort of self-punishment, or at least to the belief that you are not worthy of the best care, that you don't matter maybe that much. So that was the first driver I found very interesting, the archetypal self-loathing. Moving on to the next point, it sort of ties into it, is the medication adherence I was talking about. And the most striking evidence of this paradox between, you know, not treating ourselves the best way we can is found exactly in medical compliance. Patients are frequently much more diligent in administering even life-saving treatments to pets than to themselves. It's crazy, right? Or at least it sounds crazy, but the data clearly shows that. And 1/3 of patients with chronic illnesses exhibit this low medication adherence, a failure driven by depression, anxiety, and/or a lack of moral obligation toward the self. And interestingly, this non-adherence persists even after catastrophic events, such as stroke, suggesting that not even the fear of death is often sufficient to overcome the psychological barriers to self-care or to the best self-care. Several factors contribute to this chronic failure. It's lack of involvement in the treatment decision-making process, for sure, suboptimal health literacy, and deep-seated health beliefs regarding the effectiveness of treatment. They all play a role, as well as social isolation. But lastly, and crucially, poor mental health, specifically depression, is a primary driver of self-neglect, often creating this sort of feedback loop where the individual feels too poorly to care for themselves, leading to further decline in their condition. And, for example, the World Health Organization has noted that increasing the effectiveness of adherence interventions may have a far greater impact on the health outcomes than any improvement in the specific medical treatments themselves. That's very interesting, isn't it? So another driver behind us not treating ourselves with the best care might be, apart from what we heard about social isolation, deep-seated health beliefs, poor health literacy, it might also be about poor mental health, specifically depression or anxiety, for example. Moving on to the third point, this one is pretty quick, but also very, very interesting. It's the sort of temporal self or recognition of temporal selves. A significant cognitive, I would say, hurdle is also a piece of research called the stranger effect. Functional magnetic resonance research, neuroimaging, shows that the neural patterns activated when thinking about the future self resemble those used when thinking about a complete stranger. So this creates sort of a disconnect where the present self is unwilling to make sacrifices like exercising or saving money for a future self because it doesn't recognize it as its own identity. There's sort of a temporal identity dissonance happening. And to bring this idea into everyday life, it's the typical story of, the night guy who stays up late because he doesn't care about morning guy who will have to deal with the exhaustion. I'm sure many of you can relate to that story. I can as well. So that's another piece of puzzle, this sort of disconnect between present us and our future selves. Fourth point I mentioned, or fourth driver, is self-sabotage and ego protection. And self-neglect often serves as a self-handicapping strategy to protect self-esteem. Because by creating obstacles, like lack of preparation, lack of savings, whatever, an individual provides themselves with an external excuse for potential failure. Now, when I sort of started researching into that, I was almost shocked by how familiar this sounds. And I immediately started thinking about it. Can this be, for example, a response to perfectionism, our subconscious trying to protect us from this other part of ourselves? And I would say it's true, in part. This behavior allows the individual to maintain a sort of fragile and superficial sense of self-worth. And some factors that play a role here can be imposter syndrome, the persistent belief that one is a fraud, leading to the sabotage of achievements to avoid being found out, sort of typical imposter syndrome behavior. Secondly, repetition compulsion, Freud's concept of recreating patterns of failure because they feel familiar and therefore safe, even if they are destructive. And thirdly, fixed mindset, the belief that abilities are unchangeable, leading to a fear that one's best effort might not be enough, which results in avoidance or lack of effort. And I think, even though it might not sound like that initially, I think this is very closely tied to perfectionism. At least it makes sense to me. Because if you know yourself that you can almost never, satisfy your part that demands perfection, because of course nothing is ever perfect. If you know that you can never satisfy this part, then it's possible that you will be sabotaging yourself because you know that your best effort might not be enough. So again, you sort of go for the external excuse as a protection against potential failure of this perfect part. That's also super interesting, and I have to admit that this point was it hit close to home, what can I say, right? And lastly, I mentioned cultural glorification. There can be an instance when societal norms often reward stress bragging and hustle culture, where productivity is equated with morality, basically. And this can be the typical one-upping each other with how long you stayed up last night preparing for today's exam, right? Again, something I can relate to. And of course, these types of environment then celebrate extreme endurance and self-sacrifice as signs of whatever loyalty, leaving in turn little room for setting boundaries and prioritizing health. So these were the 5 drivers or primary drivers I found out that can play a role behind the question why we often don't treat ourselves with the best possible responsibility and the best possible care. It was the archetypal self-loathing, sort of we are not worthy because we have failed and we have our own sins and bad habits and whatever. Then is the example of medication adherence, again tying it into the lack of moral obligation toward the self, and adding the layer of poor mental health, depression and anxiety. Then the dissonance or disconnect between our present selves and our future selves. We don't see the future selves as part of our identity, so we don't care about them as much. Then the self-sabotage and ego protection. It's the providing ourselves with an external excuse for potential failure, sort of self-handicapping ourselves to avoid any failure or quote-unquote failure. And then the last point was cultural glorification. It's almost sometimes ingrained in our culture to, trying to one up each other of how poor our situation is or how badly we slept last night and these kind of things. So hopefully that makes sense. Now let's turn our attention to the third and last part of this episode, and that's what can we do to course correct, right? Now we know why is it important to demand the best for ourselves, not only from the selfish point of view, but also from the more holistic, higher purpose perspective. We know why we might have a tendency not to do it. And now let's take a look at some strategies or tactics of what can we do to improve this situation and these habits. Now, whatever the reason might be for the individual, there always seems to be several things one can do to sort of, again, course correct. And that can often require a combination of structured discipline to form a new and healthier habits, cognitive reframing, and even clinical interventions. Firstly, I would like to mention third-person point of view, which is a very simple sort of a trick where you try to think about yourself and view yourself through the lens of a third person, sort of like playing a video game and taking care of your character, right? It's, for example, I use this tactic when journaling, writing in a third or sometimes second person. But the important thing is that this approach can create sort of psychological distance between what's happening right now, which can, of course, sometimes be a bit overwhelming, you're in emotional distress, all those types of things. And it creates distance between that and this sort of more logical and objective part of yourself that tries to then take care of this character you now view from a bit far away. It gives room for more compassionate decision making, I would say, which can in turn help reduce distress and pressure in the moment. So that's one trick I would recommend, trying to view yourself or think about yourselves in third person point of view. Second is second tip. Second tip is more clinical, I would say, and it's the proposed model of internal family system, because models like the internal family system, if I understand correctly, suggest viewing each of our internal parts as having a place at the table during a family gathering, which is the decision making in practice. And this means that each of our parts also has its role and goals. And this separating our inner voices like this can then lead to realizations that, for example, our inner critic, which can be the driver of self-sabotage, like we talked about previously, is in reality not an enemy, but this sort of a concerned, protective voice, only using harshness to shield us from perceived pain or potential rejections, right? And secondly, this realization, or the realization that it's not only one voice, or this inner critic isn't the only voice at the gathering, is also important. We don't have to follow this one voice blindly. There are plenty of other voices as well. So approaching these different parts with curiosity, asking them, what is your goal? Why are you, sort of pushing me in this direction? Rather than resistance or anger. Fuck you, man, why do I always do this? And you start hating on them. So curiosity over anger can help guide you to a state of calmer and compassionate internal guidance, I would say again. So that's another tip, this sort of internal family system or inner council, I think I've also heard it referred to as sometime. And last but not least, third point I wanted to mention is discipline as an act of love. Because establishing stable routines for sleeping and eating and exercising and whatever else is essential for the brain's sort of master control system. Discipline, keeping the promises you make to yourself, I would say, is the highest form of self-respect and the mechanism by which chaos is transferred into habitable order, again, in the words of Jordan Peterson. And you might not like to hear this, but even though we are talking about self-love in this episode, basically, that doesn't mean that everything is smooth sailing, resistance-free, bubbly voyage on a pink fucking calm ocean waves, right? Maintaining discipline in any area of life is a difficult task, often full of ups and downs, fuck-ups and hard decisions. However, as I mentioned, it is absolutely paramount in building true self-love and self-respect. That means going to bed at the time you said you are going to go. That means getting up in the morning on time. That means stop scrolling TikTok or Instagram reels. That means going to the gym even when you don't feel like it. It means cooking a meal at home and not buying fast food even though you are tired. It means not texting your ex even when you feel alone at night, etc. Hopefully, through the lenses of today's episode, you see how this is exactly what it means to treat yourself as someone you are responsible for helping, with this sort of rigorous but loving discipline. And to conclude today's episode, I'm going to leave you with two of my favorite quotes. First is from Jocko Willing, and it simply states, "Discipline equals freedom," which I believe to be true in basically any area of life, whatever we are talking, exercise, finances, or mental health here as well. Second quote is from Epictetus. "How long are you going to wait before you demand the best for yourself?" Hopefully, after listening to this episode, not even a minute longer. And that smoothly brings us to the end of today's episode. I hope you find the contents sort of useful, that you learn something new. And again, feel free to share any part of your journey in learning to treat yourself as someone you're responsible for helping, your struggles, your problems, or even your questions. I'm always interested. And with that, take care of yourselves. Hear you next time. Bye.